Hello and welcome to another exciting lecture for Introduction to Psychology. In this lecture we will be covering the first half of developmental psychology. So we're going to look at infancy and childhood mainly, but you see the plus there because one of the things I teach developmental, and one of the things with developmental, I don't really like the view of going through by age. I more prefer by topic, but your book does it by age, so I'm going to go through it in the way that your book does. But at the same time, some of the things as I bring them up, I'm going to bring up stuff that happens throughout the lifespan rather than just in childhood. So especially when we get into the psychosocial stages and things like that. Quick preview of what we're going to be covering in this chapter. We're going to look at human development in general. Then we're going to go through the ages in that way by starting with prenatal development. Then we'll look at physical development and emotional development, going to attachment, and then into Piaget. And really when you get into Piaget and social development, those types of things, you can't just look at childhood, you have to look at it throughout the life. So in those, when we start looking at that, we'll look at things going from childhood on. And then in the next chapter, we will finish that up and fill that out with the adolescent into adulthood things. So first we have to look at what is human development. So when we look at developmental psychology, when we're talking about human development, we are talking about these systematic changes that occur between conception and death. But also you see in here, you've got changes and stabilities, because both are important. Development isn't just concerned with changes, it's concerned with the stabilities that occur as well in your lifespan. These changes and stabilities can occur in three major domains, which we will be going through these: the physical domain, the cognitive domain, and the social domain. And along with that changes and stabilities, we look at this involving gains, losses, as well as neutral changes and stabilities in each of the phases of the lifespan that include growth and aging. Now, if this was development, I would talk about the stages of the lifespan. We're not in developmental psychology, so I'm not going to go into that as much. This is mainly just kind of an overview of what you would get in developmental psychology. So we're not going to go over the exact stages. I'm not picky about that. Just want to point out that there's three broad domains that development occurs in: physical, cognitive, and social. And development involves gains, losses, neutral changes, as well as stabilities in both growth and aging. Anytime we talk about development, we have to talk about the nature-nurture debate. Now, the nature-nurture debate basically is the debate, and we talked about it a little bit in the first week, but how much does nature factor into a person's biological, emotional, cognitive, personal, and social development, and how much does their nurture, their environment, factor in? So how much is it nature, how much is it nurture? And it really is a balancing act. First, you've got nature. This is basically influences of heredity, your genetics. So there's this emphasis on maturation and how biological development happens according to a plan. On the other side of that, there's the nurture side. That is, that the environment's what's important. You get this term tabula rasa. Tabula rasa translates into blank slate. The learning theorists were very much nurture, and they believed that humans were tabula rasa. We were blank slates to be written on by the environment. And there's this strong emphasis on learning and how experiences environment cause changes in thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Throughout different periods of time in the history of psychology, there's been an emphasis on the nature side, and then there's also been an emphasis on the nurture side. We're at a point now, the modern view basically looks at human development as occurring as a combination of nature and nurture. I'm going to spend a couple slides looking at that just to get that more of an emphasis on that. But the basic take home is that modern developmentalists, modern theorists, modern researchers look at development as not just nature, not just nurture, but a combination of nature and nurture, and how they interact to result in the thoughts, feelings, behaviors, emotions, social development, all of those, how those are a result of an interaction of nature and nurture. Let's actually look at one of the things that's my favorite thing to talk about in developmental, and that is the diathesis stress model. So this takes that nature versus nurture and kind of looks at it in a deeper way, because essentially what the diathesis stress model is showing, and even stating in its name, is you've got a combination of biological predispositions as well as environmental factors that interact with those predispositions to get a resulting developmental outcome, or any resulting outcome. The thing I always like to use as my example when I'm looking at this is depression. So whenever we look at things like any disorders, one way we can look at it is using the diathesis stress model, though it does extend into pretty much any developmental outcome that occurs with a combination of genes and environment. But let's look at this, one of these psychopathologies, depression. So you have classes here. These 6 classes that you see, these are basically the fill that they're at right now. I'll draw over them. This one's at the bottom, this one's at the bottom, middle, top. The fill that they're at right now is essentially a person's genetics. It is their predisposition. It is their biology, their biological makeup. And what I'm getting at here, I should say this first, is if a cup overflows with water, if the water overflows the top, that essentially means that individual, so each of these cups is an individual, if the water overflows, that individual develops whatever it is we're looking at. So in this case, we're looking at depression. So if the water overflows over the top of the cup, that person develops depression. So you've got these biological predispositions. That is the genetics that go into it. That is the fill that you get when the person is born. So these are essentially at birth, you see the levels they're at right now. But then let's look at, so we're going to look at on the right now, let's look at these two. Now you've got these two here, and let's use a different color, blue for water. So what we've got here is now the person on the right here has a stronger predisposition than the person on the left for developing depression. Their genetics, their genetic makeup, make them more prone to getting depression. That's why you see their glass is already half full from the start. But then you get factors that weigh in. So you get, let's say, you have something that occurs that causes the water to fill up in both of them. Something like, let's say, a stressful friendship or a relationship breakup. Then you get the loss of a loved one. One of their caregivers, their loved one dies, and they fill up. And then you get something else that happens, like so the loss of a loved one was a grandparent, and let's say their parents get divorced, and we've got the fill to here, and this one overflows. In that case, this one, the one on the right, gets depression. The one on the left does not. What I'm saying there is that in the same environment, both of these people were in the exact same environment. Let's say they were siblings, fraternal twins, so they had the exact same environment. The exact same environment, though, results in the one on the right developing depression. The one on the left did not. Another way to look at this, let's actually switch to now, let's use yellow and look at these two individuals right here, this one and this one. Now these two individuals, they're identical twins, okay? They were born together, they've both got a high predisposition to depression. However, this one over here on the left, the stressful life events that happen to them, let's see if that'll stay there, barely cause any addition of effect on their predisposition. So they go through a relatively easy life in adulthood. They have a stable job, they have stable relationships, whereas the person on the right, they have breakups and lose their job, things like that. So in this case, the person on the right gets depression, the person on the left doesn't. So even with the exact same genetic predisposition, the environment can cause differences to occur there. I could go on with another example, but I think you get it here that we've got this biological predisposition. That's the water level at birth. And added to that, we get water, we get these stressful life events that occur, and some people will develop depression, some won't. And as I said before, this works for just about any developmental domain that you want to talk about. You can look at this predisposition to be a certain height, and one gets good food, good nutrition, the other doesn't. Well, the one with the good nutrition is going to reach their predisposition for height. The other one is not necessarily going to reach their predisposition. So that's where you get this genetics and environment mixing together. Let's look at one more thing on that, because this is one of the things that I like as well. There's a lot of research that's been done on it lately in the domain of evolutionary psychology. You know, I love evolutionary psychology. So in the domain of evolutionary psychology, and this works in bio too, but we have what's called life history theory. So life history theory is, in a sense, its original context was, the original life history theory was looking at between species. And what it basically looks at is how the environment that a species lives in affects various different developmental things that species has. So the one I always look at is rabbits and elephants. So rabbits, they are very susceptible to predation. Because they're very susceptible to predation, the evolutionary pressures on them, it was basically on the rabbits to reproduce younger, sooner, and have more offspring. That's because if they're so susceptible to predation, they need to start reproducing before they themselves are vulnerable to predation, and at the same time, they need to have enough offspring that some of those will survive predation. So species that are very vulnerable to predation have what's called a fast life history. Species with fast life history tend to be smaller. They tend to reach sexual maturity quicker. They tend to have many offspring, those types of things. And again, that's because they're susceptible to predation, so the environmental pressures cause them to have this faster life history. Elephants, on the other hand, have a slow life history. They're not vulnerable to predation, other than humans, but throughout most of evolutionary history, they wouldn't have been vulnerable to predation. And I mean, occasionally some might get taken out by lions and things like that, but it's unlikely. So elephants, there wasn't this evolutionary pressure on them to reproduce at a young age to have more offspring. So because of this, they've got a slow life history. They wait longer to reach sexual maturation, start reproducing themselves. They grow larger, various different things like that. They have longer lifespans. All of those are related to fast and slow life history when we're talking about the traditional life history theory. That is the traditional bio-life history theory. That has been adopted to look at, well, what happens within a species? So within a species, how does this fast versus slow come out within a species? And this is now looking at how early life environment and social factors can affect later life outcomes in an individual. So we're no longer looking at between species, we're looking at between individuals or within individuals. And so what I'm looking at here and what's been looked at, what the research has looked at, is how early life factors in humans, such as stress, the attachments, such as change in father figure, I'll come back to that one because that's actually a pretty big one, availability of resources, SES, which is social economic status, basically wealth that the individual and the family has, and other indicators of mortality, how those actually affect later life outcomes, such as age at puberty, age at first sexual encounter, age at having first offspring, aggression, risk-taking, mate guarding, these types of things. And the research has shown that all of these later life outcomes down here are actually affected by these early life factors. I said I'd come back to change in father figure. Let me just change the color for a minute so we can look at that. Change in father figure is an interesting one. This one's the one that's probably had the most research. What has been found is if there is a change in father figure in the home within the first 2 years of life, so before a person is really consciously aware of having to have memories by then, so just something that can occur before the mind is developed enough to develop memories that we'll talk about later in the semester. But even before that, this change in father figure in the first 2 years of life. And change of father figure here doesn't mean necessarily directly related to a biological father figure. It could be a change from a biological father figure to a non-biological father figure, change from a non-biological to a biological, or a change from one non-biological father figure to another non-biological. It really doesn't matter the actual genetic relatedness here. All that matters is there's a change in the father figure in the home in the first 2 years of life. And what has been found is that in girls, not guys, this doesn't actually affect guys. In girls, this actually affects age at puberty. Girls that have a change in father figure will tend to reach puberty earlier. Age at first sexual encounter. Girls that have a change in father figure tend to start having sex earlier. Age at first offspring, they'll tend to start having children earlier because they started having sex earlier. There's other things that can be added on here that I didn't put in the later life outcomes. The change in father figure leads to more likely to use drugs and alcohol, less likely to finish high school, less likely to go to college, less likely to get a job. Those are all related to change in father figure in the first 2 years of life. When you think about that, that's actually an amazing thing. I'm not saying it's positive or negative. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's an amazing thing that something as basic as a change in father figure in the first 2 years of life can completely alter the course of a person's development later to the point where they even reach puberty earlier. So these are the types of things where life history theory, the research is starting to see that there's a lot of this where you get these types of things that can really affect later life outcomes. These three here, availability of resources, SES, and indicators of mortality, these actually affect boys, and they affect these three at the bottom, aggression, risk-taking, and mate guarding. So boys who went early in life, in the first few years of life, have a lack of resources, low SES, and indicators of mortality such as people dying around them, parents, aunts, uncles, those types of things where they get this indicator of mortality. These are the type of people who tend to be more aggressive, take more risks, and also be more aggressive with their mate guarding. And really what this comes down to is those same types of things we were talking about up here at the top with the rabbits and the elephants, how fast and slow there worked because of the environment. The rabbits adopted a strategy that was best for their environment. The elephants adopted a strategy that was best for their environment. It wasn't within individuals, it was over generations of selective pressures. Well, the same is true in a way with the individual type of life history theory, in that these strategies, these differential strategies, such as reaching puberty earlier, such as having sex earlier, having kids earlier, is more beneficial in an environment that's unstable. Change in father figure indicates that it's an unstable environment. So humans have very large potential for adaptation in this domain of development that allows them to change and adapt to their differential environments, especially these early life differential environments. Okay, I've gotten really long-winded. I didn't intend to spend that much time on these slides, especially with this set of slides that's so long. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to go through these next ones a little bit fast. I'm not going to spend as much time on them. Thank you for sticking with me, though. I really get passionate when I talk about things like life history theory. Okay, let's go through the lifespan a little bit. So development, again, it starts at conception. It doesn't start at birth, it starts at conception. So what is conception? That's the union of the mature ovum and sperm and the genetic material of both parents combined to form a zygote. We get this prenatal period. So the prenatal period is the period from conception to birth. And what is the prenatal period, or what makes it up? It is the mother's womb, which is a protective environment for fetal development. Though there are some vulnerabilities still present, which we'll talk about in just a few slides, the mother's womb, and again, the reason why humans have 9 months gestation is because we have evolved this ability to have a lot of development occur before birth even occurs. So that's why the mother's womb, it's a protective environment. We've got that 9 months of protection. The reason it only lasts 9 months, I didn't talk about that in these slides, but the reason it only lasts 9 months is because at that point in time, the baby's head becomes too big for the birth canal. So that's when the birth has to happen just by biology. There are 3 phases of the prenatal period. There's the germinal, the embryonic, and the fetal. And I've got slides for each of those. Let's start with the germinal. The germinal lasts about 2 weeks, and this is a period of time where this zygote is dividing through mitosis. It's forming a blastocyst, it's implanting in the uterine wall. Basically, it's rapid cell division, and the zygote is moving around and finding a good place to implant in the uterine wall. We figure the end of the germinal period at about the time where implantation is complete. I will point out that in this first 2 weeks, there is a very high chance of things like miscarriages, spontaneous abortions. It's because the mother's body is able to detect if there's any genetic abnormalities or anything that's causing the baby to not develop normally. So during this time, a lot of the actual conceptions that occur do end up in miscarriages, and typically the mother doesn't even know she was pregnant. What we know from studies is that about 60% of the time when a egg gets implanted with a sperm where conception occurs, that a miscarriage, a spontaneous abortion occurs at some point in the pregnancy, usually within the first 2 weeks before the mother even knows she's pregnant. Then we get the 3rd to the 8th week, which is the embryonic period. During this time, every major organ of the body is developing, and I'll actually come back to this, but during this time, the brain, the spinal cord, the heart, the facial features of the limbs, the development is starting. And sexual differentiation is another thing that occurs during this time, so you can start to see the differences between male fetuses and female fetuses. Then from the 8th week on, we get the true fetal period. This is from the 9th week until birth. During this time, cells are proliferating, migrating, differentiating. Basically, the organ systems are continuing to grow. They're beginning to function. All of that organ and cell development is going on. And we get to what's called the age of viability at 23 weeks. The age of viability becomes when the brain, and specifically the respiratory system, are sufficiently developed to survive outside the womb. Before this, in this 23-week age of viability has been getting earlier and earlier even 20 years ago, it was about 25, 26 weeks. We're down to about 23 weeks. One of the issues is this is probably about the earliest we'll be able to get to without being able to put a developing fetus fully on a artificial womb. That is because the lungs aren't, the respiratory system isn't developed enough to work to absorb oxygen until about the 23rd week. So before this, the fetus 100% relies on the umbilical cord and the transference of oxygen and nutrients through that. And once birth occurs, the umbilical cord is no longer working like that, so it's not something that we can with technology get around unless we can do basically an artificial umbilical cord. I told you I'd talk about that period during, well, the period where a lot of the organs are developing, the embryonic period into the fetal period. Well, that's because teratogens are something that's still a factor, something that still should be considered. So teratogens are any agent that can harm a developing fetus. They can cause deformities, brain damage, even the miscarriages, spontaneous abortions that I was talking about. These include drugs and medication, diseases, and environment. And we'll look at those a little bit more, but I'm going to basically go over them briefly. I'm not concerned with you knowing the specifics of the teratogens, just that the teratogens do have an effect. Before we get into the actual teratogens themselves, though, we need to look at a few things relating to teratogens. So the first is the critical period. So the critical period is the period of time where the organ that the teratogen is affecting is growing the most rapidly. So when you look at these, it's these light blue bars. And the earliest, and let me even use light blue to go with it, teal, even though I don't have a teal, but you get starting at about the second and a half to third week, but most of them don't start until about the 4th week. And these critical periods go until about the 12th week on the tail end, though quite a few of them are only until the 8th week. So that's where you get that embryonic period of the 4th to the 3rd to the 8th week. This is the period of time where a lot of critical organ development is going on. But as you see here from the purple bars, it goes all the way to full term for minor development of them. So the development of these organs continues, for most of them, continues throughout the time that the fetus is in the womb. Why is this important though? Well, the critical periods are when a teratogen can have the most effect. So if you have a teratogen that affects let's say, the central nervous system, anything from the 3rd week here to the 6th week is going to have a large or a larger effect than beyond that. Now, teratogens can still cause abnormalities beyond the 6th week, but the major abnormalities will occur in that 3rd to 6th week. And as you can see here, you've got different periods of time, and a lot of these critical periods are pretty early. Mainly we look at about the 4th week as the start of the major critical periods. And one importance there is that about the 4th week is typically when people are first able to be, you can first tell that people are pregnant. It takes about 2 weeks after insemination typically to get to the next normal period, and that missed period is usually the first indicator that someone's pregnant. Then you look at about 2 weeks after that, so about the 4th week of pregnancy, before most pregnancy tests are accurate enough to confirm. Now at 2 weeks you can do blood tests, you can get even urine tests can start to pick it up, but really 4 weeks is about that time we look at as that time we know. And what's important there is that as early as you know that you're pregnant, you need to get off these teratogens. Smoking, drinking, things like that can affect fetal development, and we'll come back to smoking in a minute, but these things that affect the fetal development are things that really at this point in time need to be taken care of or stopped or reduced so that they don't affect the fetus negatively. Also of importance is dosage and duration. So how much of the teratogen is taken in and for how long. So this is for things like alcohol when you look at, I mean, this works for all teratogens, but looking at alcohol. So having a glass of wine occasionally while pregnant, the doctors are going to tell you no. But I'm going to tell you from the science, having a glass of wine, one glass of wine, occasionally, not every day, but occasionally while pregnant, is not going to really have an effect on fetal development, if any effect at all. Why? Because the dosage is low and the duration is not continuous. When you start having it every single day, when you start having 3 glasses of wine, things like that, then you're looking at dosage and duration being serious enough to cause serious damage. Also, genetic makeup is important, your susceptibility based on your mother's genetics, your genetics, those types of things, those will affect development as well. Let's look at some of these teratogens. Like I said, I don't expect you to really know them. Just know the overview of them, not the specifics. But this thalidomide is an important one. It's because it was originally prescribed to basically reduce morning sickness. And I'll come back to morning sickness in a little bit, but the interesting thing here is it was prescribed to pregnant mothers. Well, it turns out that it actually causes deformities in the developing fetus. A lot of women who took this ended up having miscarriages. Those who did have their child ended up having, some had very big and large birth defects. And really, the reason I always bring up thalidomide is because it is the thing that is related to a lot of what we know about critical periods. So why do we know that? Because we can look at when women who were taking this drug back in the I believe it was the 60s, who were taking this drug, when they actually took the drug and what abnormalities, deformities their child had when they were born. So they could tell what organs, what parts of the body were developing at what time based on when the mother took this drug. Very sad, very negative, but we learned a lot from this. I'll skip tobacco, come back to that. Alcohol, you get things like fetal alcohol syndrome, cocaine. Both of these are things you just want to get rid of. Tobacco, there's actually new evidence that shows that while it does cause a lot of deformities, someone who is a heavy smoker who gets pregnant and quits cold turkey actually can cause more harm from the stress to the fetal development than them continuing smoking but cutting down on smoking. So the new recommendation, it's kind of weird to even think about it, but the new recommendation is if you smoke when you start to get pregnant, or not when you start to get pregnant, when you get pregnant, you should start to cut down on smoking, but don't quit cold turkey. So it's just one of those things that more evidence, the more things we learn, some of those things we learned before aren't necessarily true anymore. And yes, if a person can quit without the stress, they should. A person should cut it down and quit, but quitting cold turkey causes such stress on the body that it can actually cause more harm than the quitting helps. Other teratogens, you've got diseases. There's a bunch of different diseases: diabetes, syphilis, rubella, AIDS, HIV. All of these can cause various different fetal issues. And again, I'm not going to go into them too much, just pointing out that these are things that do affect fetal development. Then there's other environmental things like radiation and pollutants. These also affect fetal development. And again, I'm not going to go into them, just wanted to cover them. Next thing I want to talk about is morning sickness. So, I love my evolution, so anytime I get a chance to talk about some things relating to that, I talked before about how in that drug that was used to treat morning sickness actually caused way more harm than good. Well, actually, morning sickness itself is beneficial. People don't like the idea of throwing up, and morning sickness doesn't just occur in the morning, it can occur in any time of the day, but people don't like the idea of throwing up. But here's a evolutionary quandary for you, or conundrum. That is, why would a species evolve to have something like vomiting up valuable calories when they're pregnant if it wasn't beneficial? Because the vomiting up valuable calories, especially while pregnant, is a very big drawback. It's very harmful in its own way. So there must be some benefit to it that would have caused it to become some evolutionary pressure that would have caused it to increase in frequency in the population. And what we actually find is first that morning sickness occurs more often in environments where there are more teratogens. So in environments where there are more teratogens, such as humid environments where there can be more bacteria, things like that, morning sickness is more likely to occur. So in those environments where it's more likely that the mother is ingesting teratogens, it's more likely that she is going to then expel those teratogens before it can affect fetal development. Similarly, food-related nausea is more common in relation to foods that contain more teratogens, like red meat. So that's something that can cause more food-related nausea, can cause more morning sickness. So there is a definite advantage to morning sickness in that it can reduce the amount of teratogens that a developing fetus is exposed to. And what's actually been found is that those who have more morning sickness have less miscarriages, fewer miscarriages. Those who have less morning sickness have more miscarriages. So those who have more morning sickness have fewer miscarriages. Those who have less morning sickness have more miscarriages. And really, when you look at it that way, then it's something we shouldn't necessarily be trying to reduce. All these drugs and medications to reduce morning sickness, all you're actually ending up doing is possibly harming the developing fetus. All right, off my soapbox. Next thing is birth. I'm not going to make you watch a video of birth, but we do have just talking about it. It's a 3-stage process. Stage 1 is where you get regular uterine contractions. During this time, the cervix starts to dilate, and this stage 1 ends when the cervix is fully dilated. Stage 2 is the actual delivery itself. It begins when the fetus's head starts to move through the birth canal, and ends when the baby fully emerges. Then stage 3 is the expulsion of the placenta after the birth is over. So again, childbirth, 3-stage process. I'm not going to make you watch a video. If you want to know more, developmental psychology looks at this more in depth. I do want to talk about oxytocin briefly. I told you before that I would come back to these, and this is one of them I said I'd come back to, and that is the neuropeptide oxytocin. So oxytocin's really interesting in that its primary purpose historically, and when you look at other mammals, so it's a neuropeptide that all mammals have. What it does is it induces birth, and it starts and continues, or it's related to the process of lactation, of producing breast milk. So these two things are things that oxytocin, and when we look back evolutionarily, historically, they're the first things it did. However, it's a very good example of where one evolutionary process can use another, where you can take a thing like a neuropeptide and it can be adopted as a byproduct for something else. So what it actually does now in many mammals, including humans, is it aids in maternal offspring attachment. That is, it's a hormone or a neuropeptide that increases attachment. It's actually been called the love hormone. And what's also been found is that it's released in larger quantities than normal in men that are around pregnant women. So what ends up happening is that male becomes more attached to the developing or to the newborn, as well as it increases the bond between parents at a time when there is a lot of stress right after the baby is born. This is actually why you get quite often this aid in attachment, maternal offspring attachment. It's why you quite often get instances where a mother who was pregnant and did not expect to, or did not have any feelings strongly for the child before she gave birth, becomes strongly attached after birth. Or mothers who plan on giving up their baby for adoption after birth change their minds after they see their baby. It's related to this high release of oxytocin right around birth. Let's look at the newborn for a minute. So the newborn, there's 4 states. We're not going to get into them too much, but the newborn has 4 states. Alert inactivity, like you see here in 1. Waking activity, like you see here in 2. Crying, like you see here in 3. And sleeping, like you see here in 4. And that's basically what you get for infants. They're one of these 4 states, and they're always in one of these 4 states. Early on, they spend about 16 hours a day sleeping. That goes down pretty rapidly after birth, but there's a lot of the time early on is spent sleeping, and as they grow older, they become more and more active as they're learning about their environment, which we'll come back to Piaget stages in a little bit and talk about. Looking at physical development of the developing child, it proceeds in a very orderly, universal sequence. It's the same in just about all people. There's exceptions, but in normally developing individuals, it proceeds in a very orderly, universal sequence. There are spurts, periods of rapid growth. There are plateaus, periods of slower growth. During this time, the senses are becoming more refined, which you'll see we'll talk about more in the senses chapters once I get those posted. The sensory motor integration is starting to occur during this time, where the different senses are integrating, the movement is integrating, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a little bit. And during this time, the brain wiring is also becoming more complex. There's an increase in thinking and communication and all of this. So this is a period of time where there's rapid brain wiring going on. Looking at that a little bit more detail, there's 2 things of import when it comes to brain growth during this time. The first is pruning. So when a newborn baby is born, there are basically way more neurons in the brain than the baby needs to use. There are way more neurons in the brain than an adult has. And what happens is that as the baby develops, as the baby grows older into toddlerhood and on, the neurons that are being used stay, and the ones that are not being used end up being eliminated. So this pruning occurs where the non-used neurons are eliminated, but the neurons that are present are now become much more connected. So you can see in the pictures here on the right, where the top picture is a 1-month-old brain, you've got these neurons that don't really have many connections. In a 2-year-old brain, they're now connected all over the place. So one of the 2 things that's occurring is the number of neurons in the brain is diminishing. It goes down. The non-used ones are being pruned, but the ones that are used are being connected to more other neurons. So there's this connection that's going on. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is some of the senses that infants have and how that kind of translates into as they get older. The first is that infants have basic visual capacities at birth. And by the way, I'm going to go back and get to those senses and perception chapters. I just wanted to get these developmental chapters up first. So what's going on with infants is they can do things like detect changes in brightness, can track slow-moving objects or pictures, but their vision is not that good. Their visual acuity is only, which is the ability to perceive detail, is only at about 8 inches from the face, and objects really have to be boldly patterned, sharp light, dark contrast, things like that, which you'll see in some slides later. But the point is that vision is not that good at a early age. Visual accommodation, again, ability to focus at objects at different distances. It's about 6 months to a year before infants can start to see as well as an adult. And depth perception, while newborns do appear to have size constancy, which you'll see in one of the videos, they typically learn to perceive depth at about 2 months and start to learn to recognize drop-offs when they start crawling, even though there's some mixed things on that. On the next slide, you have a video. Again, remember you have to hit play on it.
Everyone has had some kind of an experience feeling something kind of like fear of heights, and it makes perfect common sense that we shouldn't jump over the edge of a drop-off because it's dangerous, and if it's dangerous, then we should probably be afraid of it.
Probably. Exactly how and when this hypothetical fear develops makes for pretty gleeful research inside Dr. Karen Adolph's lab.
We're discovering some surprising things that are flying in the face of, how people have studied locomotion for the last 100 years.
Including what babies do and feel when they're on a ledge.
So the story about fear of heights is that there was a very, very famous classical study in developmental psychology by Gibson and Wack in 1960 that showed that human infants and infants of a number of different species will avoid crossing over an apparent drop-off on what they called a visual cliff.
As soon as a baby can move about, he can be observed in the same way as other animals.
It's a glass table, and on one side there's a checkerboard pattern surface right under the glass. The other side of the table, the pattern surface is way down on the floor. So visually, it looks like a big 3-foot drop-off. So when human babies first begin crawling, most of them will crawl over the apparent drop-off, but after several weeks of crawling experience, then they'll begin to refuse to crawl over the drop-off. And the conventional interpretation of this was that infants are avoiding the drop-off because they're afraid of heights.
She's backing away very quickly.
No, she's not interested.
She wants no part of that side.
The experiment became the shaky foundation for the myth that crawling innately teaches us to fear heights.
Babies avoid going over the drop-off because they're afraid of heights. How do we know they're afraid of heights? Because they avoid crawling over the drop-off. So as you may have noticed, the argument is circular.
As it happened, the visual cliff was a better test of an infant's depth perception, not their fear of heights. And if you look closely, you may have actually noticed that the babies don't look particularly scared.
It is a perfectly safe surface of support. So after one trial, human infants cleverly figure this out, and then they will crawl over the drop-off.
So how do you really test if a baby's scared of heights?
You can test babies at the edge of a real cliff where there's no safety glass. It's just an actual drop-off, and the drop-off can be adjustable, so it can be little or really, really big.
And why stop there? Inside Dr. Adolph's Infant Action Lab, babies are tested on a variety of apparatuses.
You can test babies at the edge of a slope, so it can be steeper, 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 crossing bridges that are wide or narrow over a surface of support, and so on. If there's no safety glass, you can test the same baby dozens and dozens of trials in the same session. And that means that you can determine for each individual infant when they think that that surface is safe and when they think it's risky within a couple of degrees of accuracy, like 2 degrees of accuracy for a slope.
Dr. Adolph has spent 25 years running tests like these, and the resulting data sets are both convincing and adorable.
Infants spend most of each trial right at the edge of the precipice. They're reaching their arm down over the drop-off. They are putting their little feet or their little hands on the bridge and taking little tiny steps at the edge. And all the while they're doing it with either neutral or positive facial expressions.
What's more surprising is how their approach changes as they learn different forms of locomotion.
So what happens is that when babies first begin crawling, they'll crawl right over the edge. Then over weeks of crawling, their responses get more and more accurate until finally they're at adult-like levels so that they can tell precisely whether a slope is safe for crawling or whether a drop-off is safe for crawling. But then the next week, when these babies stand up and face these same drop-offs, same slopes, same apparatus, now as a new walker, they walk right over the edge. So in fact, there seems to be 4 learning curves in development as babies learn to sit, learn to crawl, as they learn to cruise, and then finally as they learn to walk. So if they were afraid of heights, you should just be afraid of heights. In the rain and on a train and in a tree, you shouldn't see 4 separate learning curves.
So if babies aren't learning to be afraid of heights, what are they learning?
I think that what babies are learning over weeks of sitting, crawling, cruising, walking is they're learning to perceive the relations between their bodies and the environment.
They're discovering what's possible and what's just a little too far.
And you can learn that without feeling any sort of fear at all. In fact, Eleanor Gibson, the person who first invented the visual cliff, wrote later in her life, as a goat is peering over the edge of a steep crag, it knows not to walk off the edge. And she said, I don't think it's feeling any emotions at all. It just knows not to go. And that's what we're seeing in babies.
Who probably know not to go. Probably. For Science Friday, I'm Luke Groskin.
So the thing I like about that video is that it gives you the opportunity to see some of how the new research is changing the old ways we looked at things. Like again, how infants react to things like a visual cliff. And is it because they fall, or is it because of various different other things? Well, there's constant research going on that's updating it. So looking at a little bit more with infants' vision, so infants prefer patterns that have very light and dark transitions or contours, like these images you see on the right. They're attracted to displays that are dynamic, that contain movement rather than are static, and they're attracted to moderately complex patterns. Basically, they prefer top-heavy patterns, such as the human face, rather than things that are more bottom-heavy. And again, there's some evolutionary pressures going on. I'm not going to get into it too much, just want to point out that when you see all these things like Playmobiles for infants that involve all these colorful things, really these black and white colors that you see here on the right are, and very basic broad contrast, are what is the best. It's because at that age it's what infants see the best. Let's move on to hearing. Now, unlike vision, for hearing, the basic capacities are present at birth. They can hear better than they can see. They can localize sound. Basically, they start to look towards what they hear, and this is where you get that integration of senses. They can be startled by loud noises. They can turn towards soft sounds. And what's been found is that infants prefer complex auditory stimuli that's like human speech, but they can also discriminate sounds that differ in loudness, duration, direction, frequency, pitch. All of these types of things infants can differentiate at a very early age. So when it comes to hearing, infants are very good at it. It's pretty much fully developed at birth. Speech, so very similar to hearing, but infants actually respond to human speech and prefer speech over non-speech sounds. So when given a string of basically sounds, they prefer human speech. They can actually even discriminate basic speech sounds, phonemes, at birth. So if they're given a string of syllables, phonemes, and one of them is different than something they've heard before, that draws their attention. And infants actually at this age are better able to differentiate phonemes than adults are, because as we grow older, we become increasingly insensitive to sounds that are not made in your native language. So infants, when they're first born, early on, they can hear sounds, phonemes, sounds that are different from one another, that one language uses is different from one another, but as they get older, if their language that's their primary language, the only language they're hearing, if that doesn't differentiate two different sounds that are similar, then they lose that sensitivity to being able to distinguish those two sounds as separate. As far as taste and smell, newborns have a pretty good sense of taste. They can distinguish sweet, bitter, and sour. They prefer sweet. As far as smell, they work well at, their sensors work well at birth. Touch, temperature, pain. So the sense of touch and motion develop even before birth. Newborns are sensitive to warm, cold, and painful stimuli. And infants actually respond to pain and learn from experience. This is a pretty interesting one because the first time an infant experiences pain, they almost are startled. They don't know what to do about it. They don't understand what's happening. But then they learn from that experience and tend to then become more reactive to things like pain. And I talked about this a little bit already, but I want to come back to it and look at it real quick. That is that at birth, the sensory functions are integrated, meaning that a newborn will look in the direction of a sound they hear. If they see something, they'll expect to feel it as they reach out. And this integration of the senses helps babies basically learn about the world around them. All right, let's look at motor development now. So motor development is where you're basically the infant is developing the ability to crawl, to move, to walk, to grab things. So during this time, there is what's called developmental norms going on. And this is the age at which children perform various kinds of skills or exhibit abilities or behaviors. Sorry about my cat meowing in the background. I can't stop him. He's actually got a toy that he carries around. It's a toy monkey with a rattle in it, a baby's toy, but it's his special toy, and he'll go and get it wherever it is and pick it up and carry it around meowing. So that's what you're hearing in the background. Okay, back to this. Developmental norms. These are the age at which children perform various kinds of tasks or skills, which typical children develop them. And some infants develop it later, some infants develop it earlier, but you have these average ages, and just because a infant is behind doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to not develop normally. It just means at that stage they're behind. And we'll talk later about IQ, but one of the things when we talk about IQ, we talk about as DQ as well. And DQ is the development quotient. So DQ is development quotient, and that is basically, whereas IQ is measuring your intellectual ability as compared to people of the same age, DQ is measuring your development as compared to people of the same age. So when you're looking at an infant, if they haven't started crawling yet when they're expected to have, then their DQ is going to be low. And there are two major milestones that come with infant development. That's crawling and walking. And these are the major developments that we look at as humans. Just taking a little bit more, the environment is very important for learning things like motor development. So appropriate stimulation causes formation of the visual system, learning to speak, emotional development, motor development. All of these happen as a result of the environment that we're in. Yes, there is, again, going back, there's a biological predisposition. We have biological milestones. We have typical times where things occur, but it also requires environmental input. And infants can't perform complex cognitive, sensory, or motor tasks such as walking or talking until the appropriate areas of their brain develop. So again, this is where we get that environment combination with genetics. So you've got that genetics, the parts of the brain have to develop, and then you've got the environment, you have to have the right environmental inputs, and that's where you get this interaction with the genes and the environment to stimulate the development of the sensory, motor, and cognitive abilities. So Let's define attachment first. Attachment is a strong affectional tie that binds a person to an intimate companion. Intimate is a pretty strong word here because we actually form attachments to just about anyone we're around, but when we talk about strong attachments or strong affectional ties, it'll be anyone that's an intimate companion. And intimate here basically means anyone we can confide in, anyone we can turn to in times of distress, that type of thing. So when we're talking about attachment figures, those are people, if we are faced with an external threat, those who we will turn to for support or protection or help or just to feel better. So now let's talk about emotions. So emotions are very highly related to attachments because our attachments are based on the emotions that we have. And when we look at it, we need to look at how emotions develop. So in early infancy, we have what's called the primary or the basic emotions. So there are two types of emotions. The first set is the primary or basic type, and these are present mainly at birth. Not all of them are present at birth, but they expand out, and the only emotions that are present though at birth are primary emotions. These are emotions that appear to be strongly biological in nature. So at birth, babies may show contentment. This contentment is a basic emotion, and they do this by smiling. They may show interest. Interest is also an emotion. They may, by staring intently at objects. Distress, like grimacing in response to pain or discomfort. These are these primary or basic emotions that are present at birth. We've also got emotions of hunger and thirst. Yes, hunger and thirst are emotions, and these hunger and thirst emotions are present at birth as well. By approximately 3 months of age, our contentment that babies show starts to become joy or excitement. So joy and excitement, still mainly basic emotions, but it's more expanded basic emotions. Interest can become surprise. Distress can evolve into negative emotions such as disgust and sadness. Again, all basic emotions. And as early as 4 months of age, anger starts to appear. So before 4 months of age, anger really isn't there yet, and it's about 4 months of age that anger starts to appear. And then as early as 5 months of age, fear is displayed. And fear is still one of those basic emotions, but now we're starting to get into some of the secondary emotions. So the secondary or self-conscious emotions, these require awareness of the self. So they're influenced by environmental learning. Infants, before they have a self-awareness, really can't experience these secondary or self-conscious emotions. These are ones like embarrassment. So by 18 months, infants start to show embarrassment. So they might do something that's embarrassing. They need to have awareness that what they did is something that they should feel embarrassment for, and therefore they feel embarrassment. Around the age of 2, other things like pride, shame, guilt emerge. So these are the emotions that, again, require this sense of self-awareness. And slight tangent real quick, one of the things that's interesting here in relation to all of this is the fact that some people view, and historically researchers viewed, humans as the only ones that could experience emotion. And then it became just the basic emotions that could be experienced by animals because, like I said, hunger and a thirst, those are pretty obvious that animals experience those, but you can even look at things like fear as something that animals experience. So for a while there, even those who viewed animals as having emotions, it was all just the basic emotions. But it's becoming more accepted now that animals can experience these secondary or self-conscious emotions. Anybody that has a dog can tell you that if that dog does something wrong, they can feel guilt or embarrassment or that type of thing. Or if they do something right, they can feel pride. You can see it in their expressions and the way they act and behave. So it's becoming more accepted in emotional researchers now that animals beyond humans can even experience these secondary or self-conscious emotions. And this is kind of getting us to look at how animals think differently, and starting to think that more species than we previously thought actually have an awareness of self, because to experience these secondary emotions you have to have an awareness of self. So any species that is experiencing or displaying these secondary emotions, then they must have at least some sense of self. Let's now talk about actual attachment. So we defined it, now let's look at it throughout the lifespan. And mainly we talk about this in infancy, because in infancy is when the strongest attachments are formed prior to our attachments we have in adulthood to our romantic partners. But infant attachment is when an infant becomes attached to a caregiver, and it happens in the following phases. First, there's undiscriminating social responsiveness. From about birth to 2 to 3 months, infants will form attachments to any individual, any adult that is around them that's giving them any kind of care. But then from 2 to 3 months till about 6 to 7 months, we get discriminating social responsiveness. That is, they will respond and attach to specific individuals, specifically those individuals who are caring for them or around them often. Then from about 6 to 7 months till about 3 years of age, infants into children have active proximity seeking, or what we consider true attachment. What this essentially means is if they're stressed out, if there's something threatening, they will actively seek out those who they have formed attachments to. That is for protection, for security, for reassurance, that type of thing. And then from 3 years on, we have what's called goal-corrected partnerships when we form our attachments. Basically, what we are doing here is not just having a one-directional attachment, a one-directional response. We form attachments to those who can help us achieve our goals, and that doesn't mean selfishness. That basically means our goals might be for entertainment. Our goals might be to have social relationships, those types of things. So we form attachments with those who are basically helping us achieve our goals. And again, that's not a selfish aspect, because these goal-centered partnerships are reciprocal, as in both individuals are forming these attachments together in order to achieve these goals.
Attachment is a strong, enduring bond that develops between a child and his or her caregiver. Attachment forms through a reciprocal relationship between a caregiver and an infant. 6-week-old Iselin cries, and her mother responds by picking her up and comforting her, responding sensitively to the child's needs. Over time, as Lynette continues to be responsive to the needs and cues Iselin exhibits, she and her child will likely develop synchrony, or reciprocal cooperative interactions that help build strong attachments.
Did you get a boo-boo? What happened to you? Can you show me?
Initially, children show a preference for human contact in general and accept the comfort of a stranger without a fuss. Over time, however, they begin to show a strong preference for the people who care for them the most, usually the parents. As specific attachments develop, infants begin to show both a fear of strangers and separation anxiety.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really nice. Is he your friend?
Stranger anxiety is typically manifested between 7 and 9 months of age. 9-month-old Hannah is obviously distressed when held by an unfamiliar adult. She reaches for her mother, cries, and shows great relief when reunited with Mom.
Yes, there you go. Who's that? Is that the baby?
Separation anxiety begins at about 8 or 9 months of age and peaks between 12 and 24 months. 9-month-old Olivia is anxious and upset when Mom leaves the room, but is easily comforted on her return. As children and parents interact over time, separation anxiety decreases. Children begin to understand that separations are temporary and are comforted by a variety of familiar caregivers.
It's okay. Do you want this? Huh? Do you want to use it? You say no. Oh, Jenna, do you want to use it? We have to ask William. Is it all right? Is it okay? Okay, you know what? I got these for William. I'm going to get you some too. All right? Hey, William, you stay and play here, and I'm going to help Jenna. All right? Because Jenna would like some too. All right. We'll find you a truck. Nice building, Rachel. Good job making that tower.
So let's look a little bit more about what that video talked about. First of all, infants experience some attachment-related fears, specifically separation anxiety in about the time where infants are forming their first genuine attachments. If you remember, that was about 6 months of age. So from about 6 months of age until about 14 to 18 months of age, there's this anxiety about separation. So when they're separated from their caregiver, they have anxiety that can be pretty severe, pretty debilitating, and this can last for minutes, hours during separation, and the separation anxiety is quickly relieved when they're reunited with their caregiver. It does say here peaks around 14 to 18 and gradually becomes less frequent and less intense, but it should be pointed out that separation anxiety, especially with those who have troubled attachments or have maybe been abused, things like that, those individuals may experience separation anxiety for much longer than those who have the good, secure attachments to their parents. And then there's stranger anxiety. This is where between 8 and 10 months of age, continuing till about 24 months of age, where there's this anxious reaction to strangers. So you saw in the video where the baby cried when picked up by the doctor. So this stranger anxiety is fairly strong in that any individual that they haven't started to form an attachment with, they will have anxiety when they are with that individual only or being handled by that individual. Both of these, separation anxiety and stranger anxiety, do have survival implications. So when we look at them evolutionarily in our evolutionary past, we would see that having separation anxiety at times when a child begins walking. So this anxiety about being away from a caregiver, well, if they're walking, this anxiety will keep them from walking too far away. And stranger anxiety when they could be walking to individuals that could be harmful to them, then having anxiety about that would be important. Next thing we're going to talk about is a strange situation. You get to see a video about this, and then we'll talk about it. This video is a little bit longer, but it's very informative, so I definitely recommend watching it. The strange situation is where infants are subjected to 8 gradually escalating episodes of stress. So the adult will be in the room, then leave the room. The adult will come back in the room. The adult will leave the room and a stranger will come in the room. The adult will be in the room with a stranger in the room. These types of things where the caregiver departs and returns, strangers are present, stuff like this. This is basically not intended to cause distress to the child, but to see how the child reacts in these situations, because the quality that a child has to of quality of attachment that the child has to the parent can be categorized into 4 specific types. That is secure, resistant, also called insecure, anxious, ambivalent, avoidant, also called insecure, avoidant, or disorganized, disoriented. And these 4 attachments can be assessed by the strange situation, and that is how the infant reacts to this escalating series of stressful situations.
We'll have you do a brief interaction with some play. Then, in just a few minutes, we'll send you back in. You step in the door.
Everett Waters is studying how far our childhood experiences influence our behavior as adults.
We'll come down to the lab. Okay. We'll do this now.
This experiment, which I watched through a two-way mirror, is designed to gauge how secure is the crucial relationship between mother and child.
Okay, this bunny is going to go here, and that bunny will be on top.
The value of the test has been established in studies that would watch a child, 1-year-old, and then follow it up and interview them about their relationships to their parents when they were 21 years old. So we're quite confident in the long-term significance of this relationship.
Peter, that's Peter.
After several minutes' play, the mother is signaled to leave the room.
Sweetie, I'll be back in 1 minute, okay? I'll get you back in 1 minute.
It's upsetting for you. Shame, I feel. But she'll survive. The key moment in the experiment is the child's reaction to her mother's return.
Hi. Hi. It's okay.
The important clue is whether the baby's able to become calmed down by the contact with the mother, get back to play. Sometimes it takes a couple of minutes. But you see, when the mother was out, she was only interested in the mother, no interest in the toys. Now she has a contact with the mother, she's beginning to show a little interest in the environment, and shortly she'll be right back with the toys where we started.
So you would call this a secure one?
Yes, yes.
She's certainly much happier.
Now, and this is an insecure baby. We get the measure of the baby's play before the separation. When the mother leaves, the baby cries, goes to the door following her. Now, we sent the mother right back in, but the point here is not to distress the baby. We're just trying to challenge it. The baby puts her hands to her face in a sad expression, puts her face down. When she picks her up, she keeps her head down, her arms out, and then she sits in the chair holding the baby. The baby's still sullen. He's low-keyed.
So you would call this insecure
yes,
attachment?
Insecure. He's avoidant. He's not engaging her, and it's not the reunion's not effective. And it's important to remember here that the thing that upset him was her absence. Her return should be the solution to his problem. Now this is another pattern that we see in babies who are not good at using their mother as a secure base at home. This baby is also insecure. But you'll see, we get a look at his play before the separation. The mother's left, and when she returns, she picks him up. He can't calm down. He's still upset. She offers a toy to amuse him or to comfort him or to distract him, and he slaps it away. She offers another. He slaps it away. He's angry. We call these babies resistant or ambivalent because they both want her back and yet can't use the contact. We think that the difficulty is that in the past, when he sought comfort, she's been inconsistent as to whether she's available and responsive or not.
Do you think these really are indications for vulnerability for depression later in life?
I don't think that insecure attachment in infancy is the cause of depression in adulthood. However, when a child learns that he can trust his mother to be available and responsive. He's beginning to learn that you can trust other people, that you can turn to them when you're in trouble. The baby is also taught by the mother, as he gets older, how to understand his emotions, how to construe events that happen to them. You know, every bump in the road is not a disaster. This is a powerful asset when you encounter difficulties in life.
So let's go through those attachments. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what the slides already told you. I just want to look at some numbers and some things relating to it. So secure attachment. About 60 to 65% of 1-year-olds have a secure attachment to their parent. The infant will actively explore the room when left alone, but when the mother is still present, because the mother is serving as a secure base. This is an important thing to consider. We talked about attachments and how they're the people we seek out when we're distressed. Well, children, infants are more prone to being distressed, so having that secure base present allows them to be more adventurous. They may be upset by the separation, not necessarily as upset as others, but they'll greet the mother warmly when the mother returns, because they're comforted by the presence of the mother. And when the mother is present, the child will actually be outgoing with a stranger. This is one thing that they didn't talk about as much in the video, but looking at when dealing with strangers, secure attached infants, when the mother is present, the child is actually outgoing with strangers. Next is resistant. Again, also known as insecure, anxious, ambivalent. You'll see it different ways in different texts. About 10% of 1-year-olds have resistant attachment. This is characterized by anxious or ambivalent reactions. So they don't venture off to play even when the mother's present, because they have high levels of anxiety even when the mother is around. When the mother does depart, they become distressed because they're uncertain about whether the mother will return, so they become more distressed typically than those with secure attachments. And when the mother returns, the infant may be ambivalent, may try to remain near the parent, but has resentment for the parent leaving and causing stress. So if the parent tries to make physical contact, may try to avoid the parent, or not as much avoid, but be resistant to the parent when the parent is trying to comfort them. Then when strangers are present, even if their mother's around, they tend to be anxious around strangers because they're anxious in general. The next is avoidant, also known as insecure avoidant. So about 15% of 1-year-olds are insecure avoidant. They are pretty uninterested in exploring, don't actually show as much distress when separated from the mother. That's because they're avoiding the mother, avoiding attachment figures, so they're not as distressed when they leave. They might be indifferent when the mother returns, so they're avoidant of the mother even when it returns. And they actually aren't as wary of strangers. They might sometimes avoid and ignore them, much as they avoid and ignore mothers, but they also may go up to strangers unlike they do with their mothers. So this attachment is more due to parents who, or attachment to parents who are basically not necessarily there for them. So it's not necessarily neglected or abused children, we'll get to that in a little bit, but more of parents who aren't giving the children everything they need. I didn't talk about it on the previous slides, but the insecure, anxious are more due to parents who maybe have inconsistent parenting. So that's why that reactions are in such a way, like when the mother leaves, they react in such a way because they're unsure if the mother is going to return because of that inconsistent parenting. Avoidant infants do seem to have distanced themselves from the parents, and again, this could be quite a bit due to the fact that they are more along the lines of just not necessarily that strongly attached to their parents. The final one in the video didn't talk about this, but this is disorganized, disoriented attachment. Up to 15% of infants have this, more in high-risk families. Disorganized, disoriented is really all over the place. There's a lot of different things relating to it, but those who have this tend to have later emotional problems. If their mothers leave, they may not cry, they may cry, it's really up in the air. When they are reunited, they may act dazed, they may freeze, lie immobilized on the floor. They might seek contact but move away as their mothers approach them, only to seek contact again and move away again. And really it comes down to they're unable to devise consistent strategy for regulating negative emotions such as separation anxiety. We'll talk about it in the next slide or in a couple slides, but what it comes down to is these infants typically are infants who have been abused. So what it comes down to is they're very dysregulated, disorganized, disoriented when it comes to their attachments to their caregivers because of past abuse. So this is where they might seek contact but then move away because they're afraid of being hit by their parent. Or they may act dazed or freeze when the parent returns in order to not draw attention to themselves, because drawing attention to themselves has gotten them abused in the past. One other thing we consider when we're dealing with infant development is something called temperament. So temperament is basically the study of infant personality, so it's early personality. And it really what it is basically genetically based tendencies to respond in certain ways. There are 4 categories of temperament: easy, difficult, slow to warm up, and behavioral inhibition. Behavioral inhibition is usually due to abuse. I'm not going to actually go into these too much. I just really cut it down. Just this next video explains temperament well enough that I'm not even going to talk about after I'm not going to talk about temperament after the video. We'll go straight into Piaget after that.
Babies appear to have unique temperaments or characteristic patterns of responding to the world at birth. These temperamental patterns are biologically based, and they strongly influence the interactions that babies have with their caregivers. Researchers have grouped these temperamental patterns into 3 broad categories. Some babies are easy, some are difficult, and some are slow to warm up. Easy babies exhibit a generally positive mood. They are easily comforted, eat and sleep on a regular schedule, and readily adapt to new situations.
This is Abby. She is 4 months old, and she eats every 2.5 to 3 hours. She is basically a really happy child. She sits in the summer seat, our exerciser, and our swing. She basically enjoys all of our activities here. She sleeps about 3 to 4 times a day, depending on when she comes in the morning. Basically, she is happy. She's a good child, and she enjoys being at school.
Difficult babies are more negative in mood, and they do not tolerate discomfort, such as hunger, well at all. They are irregular in their eating and sleeping schedules and can be very hard to comfort when upset.
You think I can turn you over?
Slow to warm up babies are moody and slower to adapt to change. They are often characterized as fussy, showing more negativity and mood than easy babies, but eventually warming up as caregivers persist with attempts to comfort them.
Hayden's temperament is, I believe, very easygoing. He's very jovial. He's very playful, very inquisitive. He tends not to get too whiny unless he's tired, but he tends to hold out as long as he can until he gets tired. So he's a good-natured baby. In the very beginning, because he was so easygoing, we continued with our lifestyle the way that we always had. We went to dinner, we went to the Cape every weekend, you know, we went out to visit friends at parties, and we always brought him with us because he was so easygoing.
She's a great baby. She's very laid back. She's a happy baby. She's very content. She's, you know, all around, she's just she's a well-tempered baby. I've never had a problem with her, ever. You know, being just the typical fussiness. I mean, she's tired, cranky, needs a diaper change, that type of thing. Other than that, she's happy, plays. She's pretty independent too. You know, you can leave her, do what you need to do, and she'll play by herself.
Sleeps well?
Yep, she goes to bed around 7 and sleeps till about 5:30. So she does really well. Napping during the day, 1 good nap a day, sometimes 1.5. You know, she'll take like an hour nap around 3 or 4.
Babies with different temperaments require different types of parenting, and it is important to note that responsive parenting is predictive of long-term positive outcomes, regardless of temperament.
So as you should have seen there, temperament's closely related to attachment in some ways. There's some overlap there. Just temperament's more of the biological tendencies. Okay, now let's get on to Piaget. So Piaget is really interesting. We talked about him a little bit in one of the previous sets of slides when we were talking about the stages of development that children go through. And I said we would come back to it, and this is where we're going to come back to it because now we're actually going to talk about those stages. So Piaget was a researcher who basically said that humans progress through 4 stages of cognitive development. He learned this by watching his own children, and he basically was convinced that this was true. We'll look at that at the end, whether he was right or not, but these 4 stages were sensory motor stage, birth to about 2 years of age, pre-operational 2 to 7 years of age, concrete operations 7 to 11 years of age, and then formal operations 11 years and beyond. If you are reading the chapters, you'll notice that the formal operations is in the next chapter. I, again, wanted to incorporate it. It works better when we're talking about this as a topic to include it in this chapter, not in necessarily the next chapter. Let's look at those stages though. The first stage is the sensory motor stage. So the sensory motor stage is just like it sounds. It's basically where the world is being learned about and understood through the senses and actions. During this time, the cognitive structures of the brain are developing. There's sensory information coming in, motor response. Basically, it's at a point in time where the senses and the motor skills are integrating and rapid learning about the environment is going on. You even see this one down here at the right where the baby's got the ball in their mouth. Well, it's during this time that, again, they put lots of things in their mouth because they're learning about the world through their senses. And I do want to point out here this Playmobil right here. That's those black and white stark contrast colors. That is, I told you that when we were talking about that earlier, that that's those colors that babies see best. It's what babies, so the colorful Playmobils aren't necessarily good. The one like you see there is actually what they will see best. Next slide has a video on the sensory motor stage.
Jean Piaget proposed a comprehensive theory of child cognitive development, identifying 4 major periods or stages of cognitive development. The first of these stages, the sensory motor stage, spans the age range from birth to 2 years. During the sensory motor stage, infants learn to coordinate sensory information and motor activity, becoming increasingly able to act purposefully on their environments and solve problems.
At the beginning of the sensory motor period, an infant's actions are confined to innate reflexes like sucking and grasping. Soon, however, infants will begin to show what Piaget called primary circular reactions. 1-week-old Aiden moves his hand near his mouth by chance. In the next few weeks, he will begin to try to reproduce this pleasurable experience, eventually sucking his thumb or hand purposefully. Jessipina, who is 2 months old, has learned that it is interesting to open and close her own hands near her face.
While primary circular reactions center on a child's own body, secondary circular reactions involve making interesting things happen in the world outside one's body.
While she's sitting here like this, one of the things that we had younger babies.
By chance, 6-week-old Iselin causes the toy on the side of her bouncy seat to move, but quickly figures out how to keep it going. And 5-month-old James, again by chance, pushes a button on his toy and causes music to play. After several attempts, he is able to make the music start again at his own discretion.
Unlike primary circular reactions, secondary circular reactions are not based on reflexes, but represent the first acquired adaptations of new behaviors. At about 8 months of age, children show the first signs of planned, intentional behavior. 9-month-old Hayden, for example, drops one toy to grasp another.
Can you get big kisses? Can you give? Oh, you want to eat the box. You want to eat the box. No, back to the number.
He also figures out how to move an obstacle, the exerciser, to pick up a desired toy. Before this, secondary reactions were executed for their own sake. Now, Hayden has learned that one secondary circular reaction can be used in the service of another. Hayden now uses 2 previously acquired schemes in coordination to achieve a goal, dropping one toy to grasp another, and moving an obstacle to retrieve a toy.
Tertiary circular reactions occur between 12 and 18 months of age. At this stage, infants begin to actively experiment with the world, to do things just to see what will happen. Tess, for example, tries a number of locations for the teething ring, ending up wearing it as a bracelet. The development of object permanence is one of the more notable cognitive changes occurring during the sensory motor period. Children younger than about 4 months of age are unaware that objects continue to exist when they are no longer visible. 2-month-old Jessipina does not even look for the toy when it is hidden.
Between 4 and 8 months, however, infants begin to retrieve objects that are partially hidden behind a barrier, as 6-month-old Anthony demonstrates. By 8 to 12 months, infants begin to show clearer signs of object concepts, consistently looking for objects when they are hidden.
Under her hat.
Tess, a 20-month-old, reaches right around a barrier to get to a toy, showing that she has achieved object permanence. Being able to represent objects mentally is an important cognitive change, as it allows children to think about things they can't see or touch, using insight and mental experimentation for solving problems, instead of trial and error.
So just looking at that a little bit more in detail, you get a couple things that are going on during this time, like object permanence. So this is, in a sense, where something's out of sight, out of mind, that something ceases to exist when it's not visible anymore. And the logic is that up until about 4 to 8 months of age, things that are out of sight are out of mind. From about 8 months of age to 12 months of age, infants will make what's called the A not B error. That is where if you place an object behind something, and they find it there, then you place it behind it again, they find it there, then you place it behind something else, with them watching you place it behind something else, they'll still go to that first place they found it, expecting to find it there. By about 1 year of age, the A not B error is overcome, but can still have trouble with invisible displacement. By about 18 months, object permanence is mastered, and really the infant can start to see and think about things that aren't visible. I'm not going to talk about this too much right now. If I was doing developmental, I would talk about the challenges to these, and that's basically that just about every one of these is not true. The A not B error is being committed because of muscle memory, not because of the infant doesn't know that the object's behind something else. The out of sight, out of mind has been disproven. So object permanence becomes mastered much earlier than previously thought. But it is one of these basic tenets of Piaget's theory, and that's why it gets talked about. Next stage is the preoperational stage. So the preoperational stage, again, is in early childhood. This is when symbolic play is becoming important. Children can start to refer to the past and the future. Pretend play, fantasy flourishes during this time. A focus on perceptual salience becomes important. So the most obvious feature of an object or situation means that preschoolers can easily be fooled by appearances. And at this time, they do have difficulty with tasks that require logic. So because there's a big reliance on perceptions and a lack of logical thought, children do have difficulty with things like conservation, which the next slide, another video, will explain.
According to Jean Piaget, children enter the preoperational stage of cognitive development during the preschool years. Their thinking changes dramatically in that they now have the capacity to think symbolically, using words or objects to represent something else.
Sarah and Jill dress up and have a tea party. Later, they feed their doll. 4-year-old Jared pretends he is a spy kid and chooses an appropriate costume.
What are you going to be?
A spy kid. Mommy, can we go out?
I think you should have dinner with them.
Todd and Jared show further increases in mental representation. They are engaged in what Piaget called symbolic play, clearly imagining that the blocks they are playing with are something else. In this case, a building.
It's a big building? Yeah, we're gonna go in it. But I'm gonna put one on.
Despite these increases in cognitive skills, the thought processes of preoperational children result in characteristic errors in reasoning. One of the most easily observed deficiencies is the tendency to view the world only from one's own perspective, a phenomenon that Piaget termed egocentrism. Because of egocentric thinking, preoperational children hide by covering their eyes or only parts of their bodies, believing that if they can't see the seeker, then they themselves can't be seen.
Other preoperational reasoning errors result from thinking that is intuitive rather than logical. For example, preschool children are incapable of conservation. They do not understand that certain properties of objects, such as volume or mass, do not change just because the superficial appearance of the object changes. When given two of Piaget's famous conservation tasks, Olivia, Deborah, Jacob, Christopher, and Jack illustrate this lack of understanding.
Is there the same amount in each one of those glasses? Okay, now I'm going to take this one. I'm going to pour it right in here. Is there the same amount in each glass now?
No.
Which one has more? So this one has
More than this one. I'd say if that one was bigger than and that one's smaller, that one has the most.
Does that look like the same amount of Play-Doh? Each one's the same one? Okay. I'm going to go like this. Wash it down like that. Now, does that look like it's the same amount still? Which one's more?
That one. That one. Yep, this one. This one.
Preoperational children are not only tied to their perceptions, they are also unable to decenter their thinking or think about more than one aspect of a problem at a time. Their thinking also shows what Piaget called irreversibility. They are unable to reverse or mentally undo an action. The following responses to the question, why do they no longer have the same amount, illustrate these limitations in preoperational thinking. Deborah, age 3.
Because it's tall.
Christopher, age 4.5.
Because this one's higher than this one.
Jack, age 5.
Because this one's low and this one's tall.
Olivia, age 3.
That one is up, that one is down.
Deborah, age 3.
Because it's squish.
Jacob, age 4.
Because you smush that one down and that one and not that one. That one has the most.
As children move into the concrete operational stage of middle childhood, they are no longer fooled by appearances.
Again, that video explains it pretty well, but I did want to just go over it briefly real quick. So, conservation issues, this is where the child is unable to engage in decentration or to focus on two or more dimensions of a problem at once. They lack reversibility, which you saw in the video. And preoperational thinkers engage in static thought. This is this thought that's fixed on the end states rather than the changes that transform one state into another. So you see over here on the right where the one you saw in the video where if you've got these cups, they'll say these two are the same, but these two are not. Pennies, they'll say these two have the same amount, but this, they'll say the top row has more. When asked if these two logs are the same length, they'll say yes, but if they're moved like this, they might say no. You've got two compact things of dough, they'll say Play-Doh, they'll say they're the same, but if you stretch one out, they say they're not. And then at the bottom, if you ask about this is a logic problem, where is there the same amount of grass for this cow, they'll say on the left one yes, but on the right one no. And it basically comes down to the fact of logic and changing things becomes an issue. There are other limitations that occur during the pre-operational stage. And again, just like a lot of these things, there's a lot of problems with current research on these issues that Piaget has. The conservation issues on the previous one, they basically have been shown that children of a much younger age than previously thought are able to decenter, are able to do reversibility, are able to tell that yes, there's the same in both. They're easily fooled, yes, but it's not as simple as all that. Other issues, things like egocentrism, where children at this age tend to view the world solely from their own perspective and have a difficulty recognizing other people's point of views. That's why you can even sometimes at this age do the hide and seek thing, where they don't think about other people's view. And then also difficulty with classification occurs during this time, where they tend to sort objects based on characteristics such as shape, color, function, rather than in the same way we would organize them. And again, the current research has issues with this because kids are better at classification than previously thought. The next stage is the concrete operations stage. And this is the age from about 7 to 11, where essentially the concrete operations, the basics of the concrete operations is mastered the logical operations that were missing in the pre-operational stage. It's the easiest way to explain concrete operations. They can decenter, they've got reversibility, they become better at recognizing perspectives of others, classification abilities improve. And you'll see that in the video, but basically concrete operations, there's not much to it other than they've just conquered the problems of pre-operations.
In middle childhood, children show dramatic changes in their thinking, entering what Piaget called the concrete operational stage of cognitive development.
Knows what?
During the concrete operational stage, children begin to use logical instead of intuitive perception-bound reasoning. They are no longer fooled, for example, by Piaget's classic conservation tasks.
Do these two look like they're about the same amount? Okay,
Yeah.
good. Let's smash that down. Are they still the same?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Do these two have the same amount?
Yes.
Yes, they still have the same amount.
When these children are asked why they believe that the taller glass or the flattened Play-Doh contains the same amount, their explanations illustrate that they are now able to decenter, or to think about more than one aspect of a problem at a time. They are able to follow the transformation from beginning to end and to mentally reverse the process, achieving a logical milestone that Piaget called reversibility.
Just because this glass was poured into there, doesn't mean that it isn't the same amount. It might be short a drop or so, but it's still the same amount.
Because just because you flatten it doesn't mean it changes. Because it's all you did was just smash it down. It didn't change.
This before was this shape, and just because this is flat now doesn't mean that it dropped mass or accumulated mass.
That's one of my favorite videos there is on these topics, where they interviewed these kids at various different ages and they're useful for education purposes. But just that last one's so amusing because of that kid at the end. He's very just very know-it-all-y, as well as the kids earlier who just look at the researcher like, are you an idiot, when the researcher's doing the various things. Okay, let's move on to the last stage. That is formal operations. As I said, your book has this in the next chapter, but we're going to talk about it here. So formal operations are basically when the thinking becomes more abstract than concrete. Formal operations permits scientific thinking about problems, hypothetical ideas, abstract concepts, reasoning from general to specific, specific to general, various different things that can occur in more of. Formal operations is almost considered like the scientific brain, or the analytic brain. Video on the next slide for that.
The formal operational stage of cognitive development is reached when an adolescent begins to think abstractly and to reason hypothetically. When asked the hypothetical question, what if people had no thumbs, pre-adolescent children like Jalur and Jenny respond much differently than adolescents do.
We just have 4 fingers and be able to write or nothing.
You wouldn't be able
tell a person that they're like good and this.
That's good.
And wouldn't be able to write really good. And you couldn't play thumb wrestling.
Adolescents are able to mentally picture this hypothetical situation, contrast it with reality, and produce a variety of conclusions regarding the implications of being without thumbs.
Man, I think the whole world would change, kind of. I know a friend of mine who's a lefty, and in 5th grade we were just shooting the breeze one day, and she said, "You know, the whole world's made for righties." I said, "What are you talking about? The whole world's made for righties?" She said, "Well, door handles all open a certain way, tables are made a certain way, desks in school are all made for righties. You'll notice that when you get in, you can prop your right arm up, but not your left one." And sort of for the next week or so, I kept my eye out, and she was right. I mean, the whole world is sort of tailored to the majority, the righties. And so I think if we were to lose something as simple but critical as our thumb, the whole world would change. Maybe a bunch of little things, but all those little things would add up to something major, and I think the whole world would be different.
So that video is good at showing kind of how adolescents, later adolescents into adulthood, start thinking in a formal operations way. And really, when we look at this is probably one of the stages that's the most controversial for Piaget. But according to Piaget, the transition from concrete to formal operations takes place gradually over years. During this time, adolescents may show awareness of scientific reasoning, but may not be able to produce logical scientific reasoning skills until much later. And this intuitive and scientific reasoning coexists in older thinkers. At the same time, with age, adolescents are increasingly able to decontextualize, separate prior knowledge. They're able to think in ways that are more scientific and analytic, especially with our strong focus on math and science education in schools. Now, that all being said, one of the issues here is that it's not necessarily what Piaget thought. Piaget thought everybody reached formal operations. We thought formal operations for just about everything in our lives. I'll look at this in just a minute with some of the limitations, but basically the fact of the matter is we as humans do not work that way. One of the other issues with adolescence is adolescent egocentrism. So the earlier egocentrism was not being able to view things from another's perspective. Adolescent egocentrism, though, takes two forms. The first is the imaginary audience, where basically you feel yourself as the center of attention. The adolescent views themselves as that everyone's looking at them, that everyone's noticing them, that what they're thinking is what everyone is thinking about them. So if they have a zit on their face, everybody must be pointing at that zit, stuff like that. But really, that's, again, it's characterized by this self-consciousness. But in reality, that it's every adolescent is thinking that way. They're thinking everybody's looking at them, when in reality, people typically are more concerned with themselves at this age, and they're not looking at everyone else. And then the second is this personal fable, and this is that thoughts that the adolescent thinks that they're special, they're unique, that there's no one else like them, that no one else has thought these thoughts, that no one else has felt these feelings, things like that. And again, we know that that is not true. There are no special little snowflakes. The fact of the matter is, the truth is that anything that the adolescent is thinking, feeling, has been thought and felt by many people in the past. So let's look at some of those limitations, as I said. The first is that basically only even about half of all college students show firm and consistent mastery of formal operations. So Piaget's scientific reasoning tasks, only about half of even college students show it. Many American adults don't solve scientific problems at a formal level ever. And there are some societies where no adults solve formal operations problems. So it's really this challenge to Piaget's belief that we achieve formal operations, when in actuality, not many people reach formal operations, and even those who do are only likely to use formal operations in a field of expertise. So when you become an expert at something, a master at something in that domain, you use formal operational thinking. But in other domains, in unfamiliar problems, things like that, we tend to not necessarily use formal operations thinking. So it's just something to consider, that the research has shown that it's not necessarily what we thought when it came to people reaching formal operations. Then to add to that, Piaget stopped at formal operations, but researchers since then have actually shown that there's two categories beyond post-formal thought. And basically where thinking becomes not just analytic and scientific, but where you start to look at things deeper. So relativistic thinking, where you understand that knowledge depends on its context and is subjective. This is the whole view of when you get into things like philosophy and look at how the way we view the world and the things that are in the world are actually dependent on the context and the viewer. Two different people can be viewing the same thing and see two entirely different things. And then the second is dialectic thinking. That's detecting paradoxes and inconsistencies among ideas and trying to reconcile them. This is where you get into, again, more philosophical base, but where you might have a paradox in something or an inconsistency in something, and how do you go about reconciling that? So let's look at a bit about Piaget, the good and the bad. I don't have the ugly, but I got the good and the bad. So the good, his theory did stimulate a lot of research. It continues to guide the study of human development. So Piaget is basically considered the founder of developmental psychology. It's very much led down or started down the lines of thinking about development in different ways. Piaget showed that infants are active in their own development. Before this, it thought that the infants were just the product of their environment, not active in it. He showed that infants and children think differently at each stage of development, even if he wasn't necessarily right about the stages and a lot of the things that occurs. He did show that there are these different stages that do occur. And the direction of cognitive development, the sequence, was basically correct, even though cultural factors do come in to influence this. So he was basically right on the overview. The bad, though, when we look at this, is that he really underestimated young minds. All of the ages that milestones occur at are basically, in actuality, research has shown that it's younger. And really why that happened is because Piaget failed to distinguish between competence and performance, meaning that A not B error is a perfect example. It's not that the infant didn't know that the toy they were going for was hid behind the new place. It's more of they couldn't reach for the new place. So there was a gap between competence and performance. He also wrongly claimed that broad stages occur. Really what development more is basically a continuous thing that's occurring. And Piaget wasn't interested as much in social, which we'll get to some of the competing theories in just a second. He wasn't interested in the social, so the result was that he was basically just looking at the domains as biologically based and didn't look at his environment as much. So he really didn't account for variability in children's performance that might be different than that competence. So just to finish up with Piaget, Piaget got us going in the right direction, very good for that, but a lot of what he said has been proven to be wrong or at least slightly inaccurate. This leads us to Vygotsky. So Vygotsky's social cultural perspective basically looks at how social experiences shape development. He liked Piaget's stages, he liked Piaget's idea, but he didn't like the fact that Piaget ignored the social. So Vygotsky looked at how society, how culture, how the environment basically result in our development and how that differs. So even things like language, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks, and how language can shift development to different things. And one of Vygotsky's big things was how children's interaction with parents, more experienced members of society, older siblings, how all of this is basically what shaped development. So let's go into a little bit of social development, because there's a couple things that are important for social development. We'll start it in this set of slides and finish it in the next set. But social development is how a person develops basically a sense of self or identity. And this relates to their relationship with others, their social skills, their personal interactions, all of this. So the first thing to look at is self-concept. So self-concept, one of those important terms, is our perceptions, positive, negative, realistic, unrealistic, of our attributes and traits as a person. So our self-concept is our perceptions of ourself as a person. Our self-esteem is then our overall evaluation of our worth as a person based on the self-concept. So self-esteem is based on self-concept. And then the most important one, and that's identity. And this is our overall sense of who we are and how we fit into society. And this is then based on our self-esteem and our self-concept. So when we're looking at this, the three important components for social development are self-concept, how we perceive ourselves, our self-esteem, how we evaluate ourselves, and our identity, our sense of who we are. So let's start with the infant looking at this, looking at the self. So infants are starting to develop a sense of self. They're developing this sense of self through perceptions of their body and actions. In the first 2 to 3 months, they discover they can cause things to happen. So they discover that they can influence the world around them. At about 6 months, they realize other people are separate beings with different perspectives that can be shared. This is where you can get shared gaze, things like this. So this is much earlier than Piaget thought, but get this sense that others are separate from the self. About 9 months, infants and their companions can share that perceptual experience by sharing a gaze, looking at the same object at the same time. And this is something that very few other species other than humans can do. We've actually trained dogs to be able to do it, so dogs can do shared gaze, where you look at something and the dog looks at it too. But things like cats can't, and most other species can't. Then at around 18 months, infants recognize themselves visually as distinct individuals. Infants are developing a categorical self. So when we talk about the self, they're developing a categorical self. What a categorical self is a self that's classified into categories. So they will, if you ask them to talk about themselves, they'll tell you their age, if they're old enough to talk. They'll tell you their age, their sex, other characteristics. What is like me and what is not like me is essentially their self that is being formed. Toddlers continue that on, so they continue on with that self-concept of the I, me, my. So these categories, they show that they describe themselves in terms of their age, their sex, and just like infants, what is like me and what is not like me. I am going through these relatively quick because this set of slides is pretty long, but we are almost done. So preschoolers' self-concept is very concrete and physical. They will describe their categories they apply to, but also some of their possessions, some of their physical activities that they do. Maybe they play soccer, so they'll tell you they play soccer. Their accomplishments, things they've won, things they've done, their preferences. So this self-concept in preschool is starting to expand more just beyond though it is still very concrete and physical and categorical. Then at around 8, psychological and social qualities start to come in. So during this time, they might describe themselves as funny or smart. So they're starting to incorporate some of these social qualities, or whether they're smart, their psychological qualities, into this categorical self. So they're not just about their categories anymore. Now they're talking about more about their psychological makeup, basically, or their friends. So during this time, they're forming social identities. They define themselves as part of social units. If you ask them to define themselves, they'll talk about who their friends are, things like that, or who their family is. They become more capable of social comparison, so they can compare themselves to others and allows themselves to evaluate themselves. So during this time, self-esteem can go down because this social comparison starts. And during this time as well, the accuracy of their self-evaluations and their self-esteem is very dependent on, in a sense, this ideal self. So prior to around this age, children don't have an ideal self. They just have what they view themselves, whether it's accurate or not. Now at this age, they start to get more of a actual self and an ideal self, who they are, but also who they want to be. Now, during this time, children's ideal selves tend to be very out there. They want to be that football player, that astronaut, that type of thing. But over time, that diminishes, that difference between the actual self and the ideal self reduces. And as evaluations come in, the greater the distance between the actual and the ideal self, the lower the self-esteem tends to be. Good video on the next slide explaining some of this.
Children show changes in their self-concepts with age. Preschool children like Todd and Christopher are likely to describe themselves in terms of physical characteristics, possessions, and behaviors.
I put in the dirt and I put cement and I make a building. My room has dinosaurs in it, the dinosaur room. Mine is a dinosaur room, and my mom's is a girl room, and my dad's is in the middle, and mine's on the left side, and my mom's on the right side. And I have a dog, cat, fish, hermit crabs, and some couches, 2 couches, and a big TV, and some toys that get lost behind the TV.
In middle childhood, children begin to describe themselves in less concrete terms. Like Rachel, Stephanie, and Ricardo, they may describe themselves in terms of group membership.
I'm 9, go to the Marlboro Intermediate School. My favorite color is purple. I'm in 2nd grade and I have one brother and I like to go swimming. I'm in the 4th grade. I'm 9 years old, and I go to the Weston House.
In middle childhood, children also begin to describe themselves along more psychological dimensions, as illustrated by 7-year-old Joseph and 8-year-old Jenny.
Can you tell me 3 things about yourself?
I like school a lot.
Very good.
And I love art, and I like helping people. Nice, smart, creative.
So the last couple slides of this, we're just going to talk a little bit more about social development, but again, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. I've already gone into too much in this set of slides and way too much detail. So we talked about Erikson a little bit before, and I talked about Erikson's 8 stages of development, how Erikson followed Freud, but he was more interested in how basically the environment causes development. And really these social qualities. And I said before that really this Erikson was wrong about a lot of things, but there is one thing that Erikson was right about, and that is this one right here, number 5, and that is identity. So identity formation, the challenge of identity, the identity stage, is the stage that does have evidence supporting it. I'm going to talk about it briefly on the next slide, and then in the next set of slides, we'll go into it in much more detail. So during Erikson's psychosocial stage of identity versus role confusion, it happens in adolescence, though we now know it happens from late childhood through adulthood, and identity formation can continue even into old age, but it typically happens in late adolescent. And during this time, the child, the adolescent, is challenged with basically forming an identity, and if the challenge is successful, if the child is successful in making the change, then they will develop a sense of confidence and positive identity. As I said, in the next set of slides, we'll go over that in much more detail. Just wanted to give you kind of an overview of it here. And then the final thing is social learning theory. Again, we already talked about the social cognitive perspective, the social learning perspective, but let's look at it in this domain of what we've been talking about. And social learning theorists reject this notion of universal stages of development, question the existence of even enduring personality traits, and emphasize that people change if their environments change. So from this social learning perspective, personality, who we are, our behaviors, is a set of tendencies shaped by interactions with other people in specific social situations. So again, this is just another way of looking at it. When you look at Piaget and Erikson and all them who are so concerned with stages, social learning theorists are basically saying our learning is a product of our environment, and it isn't stage-like, it's gradual over time. And if our environment changes, our personality and who we are can change as well. There's some evidence for both, so it's, again, that's why I'm teaching it both, is because there's evidence for both of them lending some to the actual truth. As I said, the set of slides got way too long. It's almost an hour and 45 minutes long, and that's not even counting the videos, so it's over 2 hours long if you count the videos. But we looked at human development, prenatal development, physical development, went into emotional development, finished up with looking at attachment, temperament, looked at Piaget stages, looked at Erikson, and started to look at Erikson's stages, and looking at the end on their social development, which will lead us into the next set of slides. Thank you. Come on back.